All right, thanks, Naima. So it's a little weird to be on this side. Very used to moderating. But I want to thank People's Liberty and Urban Consulate for allowing me this moment, and for Deana for showing me great parts of Cincinnati. So we took a tour through from People's Liberty through downtown into the edge of Covington yesterday. And Deana was showing me the footprint of 3CDC's work here in the city. So maybe just to start a little bit discussing, Deana, what is 3CDC, and how did you get involved with the organization?
Okay. First of all, welcome to Cincinnati.
Thank you.
3CDC was actually, we touched on it just briefly yesterday, but 3CDC is an organization, a redevelopment organization. It was actually formed right after the 2001 riots. So after the riots, no one wanted to come downtown anymore, but before that, Main Street was sort of booming, things were booming, but after those riots, no one, like I said, no one wanted to come down, so the mayor at that time, Charlie Lucan, as well as a lot of the major corporations, got together and realized they needed to rebuild Cincinnati. And so they developed formed 3CDC and recruited my current CEO to Ohio. And they began the process. The first thing, and I have to add that everything that was purchased, 98% of the things that were purchased were already vacated and empty, and in some cases required a lot of work to get them stabilized. So we land banked a lot of property with the idea that we would begin redeveloping, and that's what we did slowly. And then the city asked, hey, could you take on this Fountain Square thing? Could you move the fountain? So that was a big project. And then throughout that time, Washington Park, and I don't know if anyone remembers Washington Park when it was Washington Park, but again, that was a big undertaking. So 3CDC, it started off as a redevelopment company, but now we do just as many events and sponsor a lot of activities at those civic spaces as well.
So can you talk a little bit about, and the first time that Deana and I spoke, it was on the phone. I had the privilege of trying to connect people between Cincinnati and other national guests that were coming in. And I remember reading about 3CDC and thinking, okay, so in Detroit, we have a billionaire who owns 100 properties in downtown Detroit. He's, for some in the corporate sphere, he's the savior of the city. He's the one who's bringing back the downtown. He's helping to revitalize and bring forth this renaissance. But if you talk to a lot of mostly black people in the community, Detroit is an 80% black city, it's usually a different narrative about access to property, who gets to make decisions, who gets to vision for the future, who gets to really shape and transform the built environment, right? So you have these two narratives that are happening at the same time within community, within the corporate sector, within media. And when I read about 3CDC, I had an emotional reaction because I thought, okay, so here's this entity that owns all of this land, that has rehabilitated a lot of vacant properties in the city, similar to Detroit. And now that I've been in Cincinnati and have had conversations with folks, I've heard the same dichotomy, right? Some people are like, 3CDC is so great, they've done all these renovations, they're doing great work. And then I've heard others who have vilified 3CDC saying they've led to gentrification and they're displacing people. So I'm just wondering what your view of the organization is. And really internally, how you struggle with and how you deal with that tension.
Well, first of all, I have to always say I would never work anywhere that I didn't believe in. It's real for me to put my efforts into an organization. But I am constantly probably defending or maybe explaining a lot of myths or dispelling a lot of myths about 3CDC. Yes, it looks as though we're like a superpower, but our goal is to really simply revitalize the downtown area, bring OTR, the Central Business District, and the banks all together so that there's not any blighted areas, dark spaces, unsafe spaces, and at the same time, make sure that things are accessible to the community. So someone mentioned, we can't promote anymore because there's all these free concerts at Fountain Square and Washington Park and Ziegler Park is doing all these things. So we can't do this. And that's it. You have to look at it like it was always the objective, if we were going to manage these civic spaces, to make them free for everyone to be able to come to and to enjoy. So we tried to put on as many free events as possible. If it's charges, it's probably a third party that has rented the space out. But yeah, there are days where, like yesterday, being able to sit in a circle and hear different things being said about the company that I work for, I'm like, oh my God, I'm tired. And I kept saying, give me the stick, and no one would give me the stick because I wanted to talk. But I left feeling like, man, there's a lot that we haven't done from a standpoint of telling our story. You know, we've allowed other people to tell our story for us. And many people don't realize just how many people, like I said, that we employ from the neighborhood, how many people that we have given second and third chances for to be able to work. And they don't realize that if you work for us and you work full-time and you work out and you're cleaning the streets and working in the garages, that you don't have to pay for your benefits. Like, we pay your benefits 100%. So I feel so blessed to be able to be in human resources right now where I can make a difference in the lives of others and in our community.
So I know that that's a philosophy for you. You've been working in nonprofit organizations for 20 plus years. Why that sector? Why HR? So a very people-centered sector, but also why for nonprofits?
Because I believe in the people, and I believe I truly from years ago understand what generational poverty means, and dispelling the idea that you can't make it. You know, so. In HR, I'm able to change the lives of others. I'm able to look at what benefits we offer from so many aspects, from PTO and how we can make the lives richer for the staff that we work with. And so we realize, too, if you're hiring people that need second chances and you're hiring some individuals from the neighborhood, they need more than just a job. They need other resources. You know, there's a reason why they're coming into work late. There's a reason why things are happening in their lives, and what other services can we do to help them come to work and be able to work. So it's just been great working with like CityLink, Cincinnati Works, and all these other organizations from social service because I just understand that it's not easy coming to work. It's not easy for a lot of us to come to work every day if we're dealing with other things going on. So I serve on a few social service boards, and it's just my passion. And one day, you know, we'll see what happens, you know.
So I feel like my journey to the nonprofit sector was very different, though. So, you know, I always thought that I would go to law school, similar to Deana, and after going to law school, run for office. Now, both of those things happened, but I thought that, you know, I would serve the public in a different way. So I went to law school, worked for a law firm for 7 years, and fell in love with real estate, which was completely unplanned. I didn't know what form of law I would practice, but fell in love with the idea of people remaking the commons, right? Seeing a property that was either vacant or, you know, destabilized, and seeing something that it could be, seeing the opportunities, being optimistic about what the community could look like, and reimagining what could be there and how people could come together in those spaces. But at my firm, all of the people who were able to have that optimism and have the power to transform space didn't look like me. So 80% Black city, a little less than 10% Latino, so 90% Black and brown, and all of our clients were wealthy, white, older men. So at some point, you know, there has to be some self-reflection, thinking, okay, I've begun to go down this path of learning how financing works, to learning how transactions work, to understanding the dynamic of real estate in the city of Detroit. This is not a population I want to serve, this client base. How can I use this knowledge to actually improve the lives of Black people? So I left this lucrative position That hurt a little bit. But, founded an organization that could really, I don't like the word empower, because I think someone said this yesterday, that inherently we already have power. It's just understanding how we utilize it. But even more than that, like what I've realized, and I don't know that I knew this at first, but people have ideas already. In the same way that the wealthy white guy has an idea of what this property should be, members of the community who live in those communities and who have seen the decline of their spaces have been, visioning for decades of this should be a community center. This should be some sort of technical center. Whatever it is, people have ideas, they're passionate, they've been working for a long time trying to figure out how to access resources to make the idea come to life. So, stepped out on a limb, entered the nonprofit sector, and started an organization that could teach real estate. So, how do you find a site? What do you do with it once you have it? How do you find financing? How do you know if it's an actual good deal from an economic standpoint? But my favorite part always is when we have community members who are taking the course at the very first class. We have them come up to the front of the class. We ask a simple question: why are you taking this course? And the youngest person that we've had is 23. The oldest, I think, was 70. I think she was 76. So it's a broad spectrum of ages, but people have these amazing stories, right? My grandparents lived in this house, and we really want to rehab it and bring it back to life. I've been living across the street for 20 years, and I've seen drug dealers and prostitutes and other things that are happening over there. And I want to make this a safe space for the kids in the neighborhood, or I want to create a community center, whatever it is. And I swear, me and the other, the folks that I work with to put this course on, we're almost in tears every time at the end. It's just like, okay, this is why we're doing the work. This is why we're in this community. This is what it means to be in Detroit in the first place for most of us. It's like, no, they're impassioned people who care about place and who care about the built environment, and they want to do something about it. So it's interesting to think, what drew me to the work was just the idea of how do we transform the city, but then I realized it was more than just, and I think this is similar for 3CDC, right? It's more than just renovating a building. It's, one, who's doing the renovation, right, is important. If we're thinking about the pipeline, who's the developer, who's the contractor, who's the architect, right? Shout out to the architects in our group, who's actually designing and thinking about how people are going to interact with the space. But then thinking further of, okay, so who's going to maintain the space? Who are we inviting in? What kind of goods will be sold here? How is any revenue that's produced in the space going back into the community? So I'm wondering for 3CDC, what that conversation is like, right? So we're in People's Liberty. This has been an amazing community space for 5 years. It's owned by 3CDC. I know we talked earlier, you're not quite sure what's going to happen to the space in the future, but in general, what's the conversation like internally when you're acquiring a property and thinking about, okay, what's next?
I really like how you ask all the questions and don't give me my chance, but I have you. I have it's all over here. 3CDC's intent, as far as the retail space and the buildings that they have, has always been to maintain the retail space, maintain control of it. We're not property managers, so if there's condos, we sell those. If we build apartments or a part of that, that's a leasing company, those are residential organizations. But the reason that 3CDC wants to maintain the retail space is because they do want it to be diverse. The only chain that's in OTR that's something that we've been a part of is graders, and you have to have graders. But as we develop, and as even if we go further and we look at what's going to go into the former Macy's building, Fountain Place, you just have to be very careful that you're not bringing in competition for the small businesses. So it has to be real diverse, and they have to be able to be sustainable too. So there's a lot that goes into it. Again, I'm in HR, so I like to just say that as a disclaimer because I don't know everything. But I do know that's our core mission. Our core mission, like I said, is to continue to redevelop and to be able to provide fair housing. We just recently, I want to say maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, finished up a project that will be fair fair income housing for individuals. So that's just been what our thing is. It's not to grow the organization. 3CDC will not grow. I think we're flat now, but what we have seen is the continued need for our community to continue to grow. So one park that I didn't mention is Ziegler Park. So when we were asked to redevelop Ziegler, they were like, well, we don't know how to do this. We've never did a park like swimming pool. But they took it on, and the numbers were that last year it wasn't, but when it was a park, it wasn't used for a park. The same thing, it was prostitution, drug sales, a lot of crime. So the year that they closed the pool, it had about 1,200 visitors the entire season. The first year that Ziegler Pool after it was renovated and online, they had over 1,500 just that weekend alone. And the numbers from this year, there were over 45,000 people who went to that park. And in Ziegler's, we instituted the Over the Rhine Rhinos, which is our swim team. So we have a logo and a rhino and everything. Mm-hmm. And it's inner city. It's anyone who needs to learn how to swim. And you hear these kids say, I never thought I would be able to swim or learn how to swim, but now I'm going to teach my sister. So then this year we started adult swim lessons because a lot of African American, I just speak from African American, were afraid to learn how to swim because they were going to mess up their hair. It's always about the hair. So there was a lot of interest in adult swimming, and then now there's synchronized swimming. But then, yes. And then when we opened Ziegler, we contracted with a third party to do a youth camp there, a summer camp. But then they came to me, they said, Deana, we really want to bring in this youth camp. We want to bring it in-house. I said, you guys are killing me. I said, you realize we're going to have to hire about 30 people. It's going to increase our workers' comp. It's just so much liability, and we're going to hire kids. And that's okay. And it was one of the best things that we did this past summer. So we just keep looking for ways to give back, to build a community. So the one thing that is sort of challenging is when people don't understand that that's the mission, is that we really want to build into the community. I can't say why some places charge $10 for a hot dog. I can't. Or a waffle for $8 or whatever. We can't control those costs. We can't control who goes in those spaces, and with the hope that, they're going to survive. So Chase.
I'm bracing myself, okay.
No, it's good, it's good. So tell me about Detroit. Like, what's the climate like? Like, I don't know.
True story.
I have some roots from Detroit. I was actually born in Detroit, and every time I go back home, because I call it home even though I wasn't raised there, I feel good about Detroit. Mm-hmm. So tell me, what's the climate like? What are some of the challenges? What's the feel of the place? What's the vibe now?
Yeah. So this is always a challenge for me because I'm a skeptic, right? Or some might say a cynic. So I tend to skew towards that. But there's a lot of beautiful things that are happening in Detroit. So I'm going to start there. And then get to the challenges. I forget who said it yesterday, but when you're in a place that has experienced so much struggle over time, you begin to create community in a way to problem solve that brings people so much closer together. And there are, and I usually think is black women, there's this network of black women in the city, men as well, but really what feels really visible to me, who are so dedicated to their communities, to their neighborhoods, to their blocks, who have held things together for so long, with not just hope and prayer, but a lot of hard work, right? And that creates an environment of innovation, of really deep innovation, right? Because there's not a lot of resources for the folks who are doing the work. That's beginning to change a little bit, but as someone in a younger generation seeing that, it's like they've been doing it for so long, and now I'm seeing my generation beginning to step up. So I think there's this dynamic that's happening in the city of folks in the prior generations who have been visioning and holding things down, and us who are a little
I'm not even gonna say less afraid. We've been demanding resources for a long time, but I think that things are loosening in a way that we are able to access resources that can then activate some of those things that have been visioned over time. So I'm seeing more of that. But on the flip side, so Cincinnati is 80 square miles. Detroit is 140, so a bigger city. And the estimates vary, but anywhere from 24 square miles to 40 square miles of Detroit is vacant. 24 on the low end if you're not counting industrial complexes, parks that are no longer being used, schoolyards. There's a lot of schools that were closed in Detroit, so it's probably trending closer to the 40. So just imagine if half of Cincinnati was vacant. So that's Detroit. And when you think about that scale, one of the most beautiful sessions of Urban Consulate, and I tell Claire this often, was led by Lauren Hood, and it was asking the question about black space in the city. And I didn't really know what to expect out of that session, but it was old people, young people, cross-generational. I think there was a range of income as well in the room, mostly black people. And no matter what the age was or the neighborhood, there was this story of loss, right? The commercial corridors that used to be vibrant and full of retail and restaurants. If you drive through Detroit now, so many of our commercial corridors outside of downtown are still vacant. If you think about neighborhoods, the mayor boasts that he's torn down 19,000 derelict structures since he's come into office, 19,000. And I'll get to this maybe later. He's asking for $500 million, so a $250 million bond, and then $250 from the general fund to tear down another 19,000 in the next 5 years. Which, just thinking again of the scale of the footprint of vacancy in the city, it's almost hard to imagine that. I myself, just personally being in a neighborhood, have seen houses go down over time. So like you see a house that if you put some love into it and the right resources, you could bring it back. But within a week, it's torn down. There's new gravel that's put down, and now you have another vacant lot. So on one hand, there's this potential opportunity to save a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the fabric of communities if you're thinking about the physical spaces that people embody. But on the other hand, you have an administration that listening in part to community, right? Like these structures are dangerous. You have a lot of illicit activity that are happening in some of these places. I'll never forget one of the heads of one of our foundations talked about being a little girl growing up in Detroit and saying how she remembers being on streets where there was vacancy and she would just be terrified and she would like run past some of these vacant houses. And now she's probably a 40-year-old black woman, but remembering just that trauma from her youth. I think that's real for a lot of Detroiters, right? Like just what is it like to experience the extraction of resources and the fleeing of our white neighbors to the suburbs? Like it left a real legacy that we're still dealing with. So for me, it's thinking about the investment, in quotation marks, that's flowing into the city. You have foreign investors from Europe, from China, from throughout the United States who are seeing as an asset class that, wow, there's all of this really cheap property in Detroit that you can buy large swaths of it. Let's go in and buy it. So we have some folks who are just sitting on land that they've purchased since 2009 forward, doing very little with it. And this is not unique to Detroit. I mean, there are other cities that experience the same thing, but the scale in Detroit is just so high. So on the one hand, you have that. On the other hand, I'm seeing, again, these folks in community, just normal Detroiters who, again, for decades have said, I want to do something with that parcel, who are fighting. Like really fighting to get access, to get control, to get ownership in a governmental environment where it's not easy to do. So I'll never forget, I was telling the group yesterday at the round table, I watch city council meetings. I don't have time to physically be present, but like at 8 o'clock at night, as I'm eating dinner, like I might put on a city council meeting and just watch it. Like that's my pleasure watching. Because if you've ever watched a Detroit city council meeting, or Baltimore or New Orleans, like shit gets real. there are some characters. And like a week ago, like this is really recent, the head of our land bank, largest land bank in the country, we have 90,000 parcels, again, scale, 90,000 parcels that our land bank owns. In response to this bond proposal, this $250 million bond, she was part of her presentation, and the council member asked, what's the process for accessing vacant property? Community members are asking. They've tried to call the land bank, they've tried to email the land bank, they can't get answers, they can't get access, they can't get ownership. What's the problem? And she said that we don't have a process. Like, her words, we don't have a process. People can submit proposals. The internal team will review it. It'll go to the board, which is a very small board appointed by the mayor. It's like 3 people. And honestly, she didn't say this. This is what I would imply. If you're in good graces with the administration, you might be able to get access. So there is no defined, easy way, or even transparent, doesn't necessarily have to be easy, but transparent way for someone to get access to property in the city, even though we have, at the minimum, 24 square miles of vacant property in the city of Detroit. So as you can imagine, it creates a very frustrating environment of people not believing that they can trust the intentions of government. And we do have that billionaire I keep referencing, who is able, however, from his own personal investment strategy, being able to access so much land. Some of it city owned, some of it privately owned. But if you can just pay cash, whether you're Dan Gilbert buying downtown, or if you're a foreign investor wanting to invest in the neighborhoods, you can buy things quickly, easily, cheaply. So there's a lot more happening, but just in thinking about outcomes, it's how do we really begin to envision space in Detroit or in New Orleans, the similar problems. I'm not sure what it's like in Cincinnati. Actually, perhaps in this final minute, thinking about, in Cincinnati, what's it like for someone in a community who wants to do something on a parcel of land?
As far as like purchasing?
Purchasing it, or even getting just access or control.
I really don't know the whole process. I do know as far as like opening up a business, and there is a process, and it doesn't seem to be not working. What I've noticed, because 3CDC along with Model Group, OTR Chamber, and I may be forgetting, they got together and they said we're going to be intentional about making sure that we have diverse and minority-owned businesses in some of these spaces. And it's been working, but what I've noticed is that the businesses are coming, but they don't even have enough resources to maintain themselves in these spaces. So it's good to see them there, but it's sad because you want them to have so much more so that they can sell so much more. But as far as like purchasing, again, I know just enough information to be dangerous, and so I don't.
So I'll just end on this. One of the things that I'm dedicated to, and I don't know if Jessica's still in the room, but awesome. Getting not only just financing, debt capital, loan capital to folks to open businesses, just getting equity to folks, right? Being able to very quickly pay for something in cash if you don't have friends and family, I know that Jessica talked about this earlier, if you don't have friends and family that can just loan you that first $10,000, $20,000, because land is cheap often in Detroit, like how do you get control quickly? More and more Black Detroiters are trying to figure out how we pool resources to be able to create those sorts of equity pools to do that work. And I believe the goal is often with our political capital shifting who's in power, but if we can't do that, at least being able to have the cash up front to say, we can just buy this without having to beg for it. So, thank you.
Thank you.